The morning sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds of Angela Mitchell's home office as she stared at the email that would change her life. After 20 years of dedicated service, countless solved cases, and breaking through endless barriers as a black woman in law enforcement, she had finally achieved what many thought impossible. The Memphis Police Department had chosen her as their new chief of police. Angela sat back in her chair, letting out a deep breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her fingers traced the frame of a photograph on her desk. It showed her father in his police uniform from 1975, his badge gleaming proudly. He hadn't lived to see this day, but she could almost hear his deep, warm laugh of approval. "You did it, baby girl," she whispered to herself, imagining his words. The appointment wasn't public knowledge yet. The official announcement would come next week, but Angela knew she had work to do before then. Years of experience had taught her that understanding a situation from the ground up was crucial to making effective changes. Standing up, she walked to her closet and pushed aside her pressed uniforms and formal attire. In the back, she found what she was looking for: simple civilian clothes that would help her blend in. Angela had made a decision that morning. Before taking command officially, she would spend a week observing her precinct undercover. Her best friend and fellow officer, Sarah Chen, thought the idea was risky when Angela called to share her plan. "Are you sure about this, Ang?" Sarah's concern was clear through the phone. "You've earned this position. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." "This isn't about proving anything," Angela replied, putting the phone on speaker as she changed into a simple black blazer and slacks. "It's about understanding. I need to see how things really work when people think no one's watching." Sarah sighed, knowing that tone in her friend's voice. "Just be careful. Some of these officers, they're not going to like having a black woman as their boss, especially the old guard." Angela knew Sarah was right. Despite her qualifications, a master's degree in criminal justice, numerous commendations, and a spotless record, she had already heard whispers of discontent about her appointment. Some called it politically motivated or affirmative action. These were the same tired arguments she'd faced throughout her career. Later that afternoon, Angela sat in her car outside the courthouse, reviewing her plan. She would spend the next few days observing various departments, starting with the court officers. Her official ID and badge were locked in her glove compartment. Instead, she carried a simple visitor's pass and a folder of public court documents as her cover. As she walked up the courthouse steps, Angela noticed Officer James Rawlings at his usual post. She had reviewed his personnel file that morning. 15 years on the force, multiple complaints about excessive force and racial profiling, all dismissed due to lack of evidence. He was exactly the kind of officer she needed to observe. Rawlings barely glanced at her as she passed through security, just another black woman in business attire. Angela felt a familiar twist in her stomach, the same one she'd experienced countless times when people underestimated her. But today, that dismissal worked in her favor. Finding a quiet corner in the courthouse lobby, Angela pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. She had already documented several concerning interactions: how Rawlings and his partners treated white visitors versus people of color, the subtle ways they created obstacles for some while expediting others through security. "This is why I'm here," she thought, making detailed notes. Real change starts with understanding the depth of the problem. As the afternoon wore on, Angela moved through different areas of the courthouse, observing and documenting. She noticed patterns emerging: certain officers consistently showing bias in their interactions, others trying to moderate their colleagues' behavior, and the public's varying reactions to it all. What she didn't know was that tomorrow, in this very building, Officer Rawlings would make a mistake that would transform both their lives and the entire department. But for now, Angela Mitchell, the soon-to-be first black female police chief of Memphis, sat quietly in her corner, watching, learning, and preparing for the challenges ahead. The setting sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Angela checked her watch. 4:45 p.m. She had seen enough for one day, but tomorrow would bring new observations, new insights, and unknowingly, a confrontation that would shake the department to its core. The next morning arrived with dark clouds hanging over Memphis, matching the tension that would soon unfold in the courthouse. Angela Mitchell arrived early, dressed in a simple navy pantsuit, her natural hair pulled back neatly. She chose a seat in the main courthouse lobby, strategically positioned to observe the morning rush of people entering the building. Officer James Rawlings was having a bad morning. His coffee had spilled in his car, his wife had served him divorce papers the previous evening, and the rain had soaked through his uniform on his walk from the parking lot. His mood was darker than the storm clouds outside. The morning progressed without incident until 10:30 a.m., when Angela moved to the courthouse's west wing, where several important cases were being heard. She sat down in the front row of the waiting area, spreading out some legal documents she'd brought as props for her observation. "Hey, you can't sit there." Rawlings' sharp voice cut through the quiet murmur of the courthouse. He was storming toward Angela, his face already reddening with anger. "That section is reserved for attorneys and court officials." Angela looked up calmly, noting there were no signs indicating restricted seating. Several white individuals in business attire sat unbothered in the same area. She remained seated, maintaining her composure as she spoke. "I'm reviewing these documents for an upcoming case." Rawlings' face twisted with rage. Without warning, he grabbed Angela's arm roughly, attempting to pull her from the seat. "I said move. Are you deaf? This ain't your place." The sudden violence drew gasps from onlookers. A young public defender, Mark Thompson, stepped forward. "Officer, there's no need for." "Stay out of this," Rawlings barked, his grip tightening on Angela's arm. "This one needs to learn some respect for authority." Angela remained remarkably calm, her years of training kicking in. She carefully observed every detail, the veins pulsing in Rawlings' neck, the small crowd gathering, the security cameras whirring above them. She noted how his other hand rested on his weapon, a subtle but clear threat. "I have every right to be here," Angela stated firmly, her voice steady despite the painful grip on her arm. "You're assaulting me without cause, Officer Rawlings." The fact that she knew his name seemed to enrage him further. "How do you know my name? Are you one of those cop-watching troublemakers?" He reached for his handcuffs with his free hand. By now, several attorneys had gathered around, phones recording the incident. Judge Patricia Martinez, who had been walking past, stopped in her tracks. "Officer Rawlings, release her immediately." "But Your Honor, she's being disruptive." "The only disruption I see is coming from you." Judge Martinez cut in sharply. "Release her now." Rawlings reluctantly let go of Angela's arm, leaving visible marks on her brown skin. The judge approached them, her face stern with concern. "Ma'am, are you all right? Would you like to file a complaint?" Angela stood slowly, straightening her jacket. "That won't be necessary, Your Honor. This incident will be addressed very soon." She gathered her documents calmly, aware of the growing crowd of witnesses. As she walked away, Angela heard Rawlings muttering under his breath about these people, thinking they could go wherever they wanted. She made a mental note of every word, every action, and every witness present. In less than an hour, Officer James Rawlings had given her all the evidence she needed of the department's deep-rooted problems. Back in her car, Angela finally allowed herself to examine her arm. Dark bruises were already forming where Rawlings had grabbed her. She took photos with her phone, then called the police commissioner. "Sir, we need to move up the emergency department meeting to this afternoon," she said firmly. "There's been an incident that requires immediate attention." The commissioner agreed, unaware of what had transpired. Angela ended the call and sat back in her seat, watching raindrops trail down her windshield. In a few hours, Officer Rawlings would learn exactly who he had assaulted, and the entire department would witness the beginning of a new era. Thunder rumbled overhead as Angela started her car. The storm was about to break, both outside and within the Memphis Police Department. The emergency meeting was set for 2:00 p.m. in the main conference room of the Memphis Police Department. Officers filed in, their faces showing mixtures of confusion and annoyance at the sudden call. Officer Rawlings strutted in confidently, joking with his friends about his morning incident with the disrespectful woman at the courthouse. The room was packed with about 50 officers, detectives, and supervisors. At the front of the room, the police commissioner stood with an unusually serious expression. Next to him was an empty chair, and on the table lay a sealed envelope and a laptop. "Ladies and gentlemen," the commissioner began, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We're here today to address a serious incident that occurred this morning at the courthouse. But first, I'd like to introduce someone." The side door opened, and Angela Mitchell walked in. She was now dressed in full police chief uniform, complete with the gold eagle insignia on her collar. The room fell silent. Rawlings, who had been leaning back in his chair, suddenly sat up straight, his face draining of color as recognition hit him. "Meet Chief Angela Mitchell, your new commanding officer," the commissioner announced. She was supposed to be officially introduced next week, but circumstances have forced us to move up the timeline. Angela stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. The bruises on her arm were visible beneath her uniform sleeve. She picked up the remote control and turned on the large screen behind her. "This morning," she began, her voice steady and professional, "I was conducting an undercover observation of our department's operations. What I witnessed was disturbing, to say the least." The security footage from the courthouse began playing. The room watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. Rawlings approaching, grabbing, and threatening their new chief. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every slur and threat he had muttered. Rawlings sank lower in his chair as his fellow officers moved away from him, creating a visible gap. The footage continued, showing multiple incidents throughout the morning where he had treated people of color differently from white visitors. "Officer Rawlings," Angela addressed him directly, "would you care to explain your actions?" He stammered, I didn't know who you were. And that makes it acceptable." Angela's question hung in the air. "Should any citizen be treated the way you treated me today?" The silence in the room was deafening. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own behaviors in Rawlings' actions. "This department has a cancer," Angela continued, switching off the video. "It's a cancer of bias, prejudice, and abuse of power. Today's incident wasn't just about one officer's actions, it's a symptom of a larger problem." She opened the sealed envelope on the table, removing several documents. In the past 3 years, there have been 78 complaints of racial profiling and excessive force filed against officers in this precinct. 78, all dismissed without proper investigation. Angela walked slowly around the room, making eye contact with each officer. "Some of you might be thinking I'm here to clean house, to fire everyone who's ever shown bias. That's not my goal." She stopped at Rawlings' chair. "My goal is transformation. Starting today, every officer in this department will undergo comprehensive bias training. We will implement body cameras and civilian oversight. And most importantly, we will hold ourselves accountable." The commissioner stepped forward. "Officer Rawlings, you're suspended pending a full investigation. Please surrender your badge and weapon." As Rawlings complied, his hands shaking, Angela addressed the room one final time. "What happened today was unacceptable, but it's also an opportunity. An opportunity to show this city that we can change, that we can be better. That we can be the kind of police force that serves and protects everyone equally." The meeting concluded, but its impact was just beginning. As officers filed out, many stopped to introduce themselves to their new chief, some offering apologies, others expressing support for the coming changes. Angela remained in the conference room, watching the security footage one more time. The bruises on her arm throbbed, but she felt a sense of purpose. Sometimes, she thought, the most powerful lessons come from the most painful experiences. Outside, the storm had cleared, and sunlight streamed through the windows. It seemed fitting. A new day was dawning for the Memphis Police Department. 3 days after the emergency meeting, Officer James Rawlings sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by empty takeout containers and crumpled papers. His suspension notice lay on the coffee table, along with a letter requiring his attendance at today's disciplinary hearing. The past few days had been a blur of shame, anger, and fear. At the police headquarters, Angela Mitchell prepared for the hearing in her new office. She reviewed Rawlings' complete personnel file, which revealed a pattern more troubling than she'd initially thought. Behind the complaints of racial profiling lay a story of a once promising officer who had gradually become more aggressive and biased over the years. "Chief Mitchell," her assistant called through the intercom, "Officer Rawlings has arrived for the hearing." The disciplinary hearing room was small but formal, with a long wooden table and chairs. Angela sat at the head of the table, flanked by the department's internal affairs investigator and a union representative. Rawlings entered, wearing a civilian suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. The confident swagger from their previous encounter was gone. "Please be seated, Officer Rawlings," Angela said, her voice professional but not unkind. She pressed play on a laptop, and the courthouse footage began playing again. This time, she had compiled multiple camera angles, showing the full extent of his behavior. Rawlings watched himself on screen, flinching at his own actions. The man in the video seemed like a stranger, angry, hateful, out of control. When the footage ended, silence filled the room. "Officer Rawlings," Angela began, "I've spent the past few days reviewing your history with this department. 15 years ago, you received a commendation for saving a black child from a burning building. Your early performance reviews praised your community engagement. What changed?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected accusations, not introspection. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water glass in front of him. I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Things just got harder. The streets got meaner. I started seeing enemies everywhere." Angela nodded, opening another file. "Your divorce papers were served the night before our encounter. Your mother passed away last year. You've been working double shifts for months. These aren't excuses for your behavior, but they're important context." Rawlings looked up, surprised by her knowledge of his personal struggles. Tears welled in his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. "The easy thing would be to fire you," Angela continued. "It would send a strong message to the department and the community, but easy isn't always right." She pushed a document across the table. "This is a choice, Officer Rawlings. Behind door number 1 is immediate termination. Your pension remains intact, but your law enforcement career ends today." She placed another document beside it. "Behind door number 2 is a different path. 6 months suspension without pay, mandatory counseling, racial sensitivity training, community service in the neighborhoods you policed. And when you return, you'll be partnered with Officer Marcus Thompson, who runs our community outreach program." The union representative leaned forward, surprised by the offer. "Chief Mitchell, this is unusually lenient." "This isn't leniency," Angela corrected him. "This is investment. Officer Rawlings' transformation could be more valuable to this department than his termination." She turned back to Rawlings. "But understand this, if you choose the second path, it will be the hardest thing you've ever done. You'll have to confront your biases, face the community you've hurt, and rebuild trust from scratch. There will be no third chances." Rawlings stared at the 2 documents, his future hanging in the balance. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Finally, he reached for the second document, his hand steady for the first time that day. "I want to be better," he said quietly. "I need to be better." Angela nodded, a small smile crossing her face. "The hard work starts tomorrow. You'll meet with the department psychiatrist at 9 a.m. Dismissed. As Rawlings left the room, Angela remained seated, thinking about the path ahead. Change was never easy, but sometimes the most damaged people, once healed, became the strongest advocates for transformation. Outside her window, Memphis continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in this small room, the first steps toward real change had just been taken. 1 month into Officer Rawlings' suspension, Chief Angela Mitchell sat in her office late into the evening, surrounded by stacks of personnel files and complaint reports. The investigation she had launched was revealing disturbing patterns throughout the department, far beyond what she had initially suspected. Sarah Chen, now promoted to Internal Affairs Lieutenant, knocked on the open door. "Chief, you need to see this." She placed a thick folder on Angela's desk. "We found similar complaint patterns in 3 other precincts." Angela opened the folder, scanning the contents. Incident reports, civilian complaints, and internal memos painted a picture of systematic bias. But what caught her attention were the dismissed complaints. Cases where evidence had mysteriously disappeared or witnesses had suddenly become unavailable. "Have you noticed something interesting about these dates?" Angela asked, spreading several reports across her desk. Every major complaint dismissal happened within 3 days of Officer Gregory's shift as watch commander. Sarah leaned in, her eyes widening. "Gregory? But he's been with the department for 25 years. He's respected." "He's also been protecting certain officers," Angela finished. "Look at these signature patterns. Complaints against officers in his circle get dismissed, others get full investigations." The investigation was already causing waves through the department. Some officers had become defensive, while others were finally speaking up about problems they'd witnessed for years. The precinct felt like a pot about to boil over. Angela's phone buzzed, a text from Officer Rawlings' counselor. His progress report was encouraging. The man who had assaulted her was showing genuine change, attending every session and actively participating in community service. "Chief," Sarah interrupted her thoughts. "There's something else." She pulled up a video on her tablet. This was recorded last week. Officer Peterson making an arrest in South Memphis. The footage showed a scene disturbingly similar to Angela's courthouse incident. Unnecessary force, racial slurs, and abuse of power. But this time, something different happened. 2 other officers stepped in, stopping Peterson and properly handling the situation. "They're learning," Angela said softly, slowly, "but they're learning." She stood up and walked to the wall map of Memphis, marked with pins showing incident locations. Red pins for complaints, blue for interventions by other officers, green for positive community interactions. The pattern was clear. Precincts with more diverse officers had fewer red pins. "We need to change the culture from within," Angela announced. "Sarah, I want you to set up a series of town hall meetings. Not in the precinct, in community centers, churches, schools. Let's put our officers face to face with the people they're supposed to protect." As Sarah took notes, Angela continued laying out her plan. "And I want Officer Rawlings to speak at these meetings once he's ready. His story, both the mistake and the change, needs to be heard." The next morning, Angela called a department-wide meeting. The atmosphere was tense as she presented her findings. Graphs showed racial disparities in arrests, maps revealed targeting of specific neighborhoods, and body camera footage displayed multiple incidents of bias. "This isn't about shame," she told the assembled officers. "This is about growth. Every person in this room has biases. The question is, what do we do about them?" She introduced new policies: mandatory partner rotation to prevent cliques, community engagement requirements, and a reformed complaint investigation process. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, others nodded in agreement. "We've also created an anonymous reporting system," she announced. "Any officer who witnesses misconduct can report it without fear of retaliation, because silence is compliance." After the meeting, a young black officer approached her. "Chief, I've been wanting to report things for years, but I was afraid." "Not anymore," Angela assured him. "Change starts with truth." Later that evening, as she prepared to leave, Angela noticed a new email. It was from Officer Rawlings, sharing his latest counseling insights and asking to be part of the community outreach program once his suspension ended. She smiled, remembering their courthouse confrontation. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best opportunities for change. The investigation was far from over, but seeds of transformation were beginning to grow. Looking out over the city lights of Memphis, Angela knew there would be resistance, setbacks, and difficult days ahead. But for the first time in decades, real change felt possible in the Memphis Police Department. 3 months into Chief Mitchell's reform program, the Memphis Police Department looked markedly different. The precinct walls, once bare except for wanted posters and duty rosters, now displayed community photos, achievement certificates, and tracking charts showing improved police-civilian interactions. On this particular morning, Angela stood at the back of the training room, watching as Officer Rawlings addressed a group of 30 officers. His suspension had ended early due to exceptional progress, and he'd become an unexpected ally in the department's transformation. "I was that cop," Rawlings said, his voice carrying weight from experience. "The one who saw threats instead of people. The one who let bias control my actions." He clicked to the next slide, the courthouse footage of his confrontation with Angela. "This was my wake-up call." The room was silent. Many of these officers had witnessed that day, but seeing it again, with Rawlings himself analyzing his actions, had a powerful impact. "Chief Mitchell could have ended my career," he continued. "Instead, she showed me something I'd forgotten. That real policing is about protecting everyone, not just some people." Angela smiled quietly. Rawlings had surprised everyone, including himself. After completing his counseling and community service, he'd asked to become part of the training team. His story had become a powerful tool for change. The reform program wasn't just about training. Angela had implemented concrete changes throughout the department. Every patrol car now had two officers from different backgrounds paired together. The community engagement program required officers to spend time in neighborhood centers, not just driving through them. Body cameras were mandatory and reviewed regularly. Most significantly, she'd established the Civilian Oversight Committee, giving community members real power in reviewing police conduct. Some veteran officers had resigned in protest, but their departures only made room for new recruits who shared the department's reform vision. After Rawlings' presentation, Angela headed to her next stop, the South Memphis Community Center. Officer Marcus Thompson, Rawlings' new partner, was already there, setting up for their weekly Coffee with Cops program. "Chief," Thompson called out as she entered, "we've got a full house today." The room was packed with local residents, some who'd filed complaints in the past, others who'd never trusted police enough to even do that. But they were here, willing to talk. Rawlings arrived shortly after, carrying boxes of donuts. Some community members who recognized him from previous incidents watched warily, but his changed demeanor was evident. He moved through the room, introducing himself, listening more than talking. 6 months ago, an elderly woman stood up during the discussion. "I wouldn't have set foot in a room with police officers, but I've seen changes, real changes." Angela watched as officers and community members engaged in honest dialogue. It wasn't always comfortable. Years of mistrust didn't disappear overnight, but it was real. Back at the precinct that afternoon, Angela reviewed the latest statistics with Sarah. Civilian complaints had dropped by 40%. Use of force incidents were down 35%. Community tip cooperation had increased significantly. "It's working," Sarah said, "but we're still getting pushback from some precincts." "Change takes time," Angela replied, "but it's inevitable now. The old way of policing is over." She pulled up the department's new recruitment video on her computer. Instead of the typical action-packed scenes, it showed officers helping at community events, mediating disputes, and working with youth programs. The voiceover was Rawlings, sharing his story of transformation. That evening, as Angela prepared to leave, she found a handmade card on her desk. It was from a young girl who'd attended the community center meeting. The drawing showed police officers and civilians holding hands around a building. "This is what we're working for," Angela thought, pinning the card to her wall next to the courthouse security photo. The contrast between the two images, one showing the problem, the other showing the possibility, reminded her how far they'd come. Outside, Rawlings and Thompson were heading out for their evening patrol. They stopped to help an elderly man whose car had broken down, their interaction visible from Angela's window. No tension, no bias, just public servants helping a citizen. The sun was setting over Memphis, casting long shadows across the precinct parking lot. Change was happening, one interaction at a time, one officer at a time, one day at a time. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was progress. 6 months after the courthouse incident, Officer James Rawlings stood before a packed community center in South Memphis. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone, facing an audience that included many people he had previously harassed or wrongly accused. "My name is James Rawlings," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "And I'm here to face my past." Behind him, Chief Mitchell sat quietly, watching as the officer she'd once considered firing began sharing his journey. The room was tense. In the front row sat Mrs. Watson, an elderly black woman whom Rawlings had roughly handled during a traffic stop the previous year. Next to her was Marcus Thompson, now Rawlings' partner and mentor in community policing. 6 months ago, I assaulted a black woman in the courthouse," Rawlings continued. "I didn't know she was my new chief, but that shouldn't have mattered. No one deserves to be treated that way." As he spoke, images from his past incidents appeared on the screen behind him. Each photo showed a moment of bias, aggression, or abuse of power. The audience murmured, recognizing themselves or their neighbors in these confrontations. "My counselor asked me to trace back when I started seeing threats instead of people," Rawlings explained. "It wasn't one moment. It was a slow poison of prejudice, fear, and power. I became the very thing I'd sworn to protect people from, a threat to public safety." In the back of the room, several officers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps seeing reflections of their own behaviors in Rawlings' words. Chief Mitchell had made attendance mandatory for officers with similar complaint patterns. "The hardest part wasn't the suspension or the counseling," Rawlings admitted. It was facing myself in the mirror, accepting that I had become something ugly, something wrong. He shared stories from his community service, working in soup kitchens, helping at youth centers, listening to families who had experienced police brutality. Each story revealed another layer of his transformation. Mrs. Watson raised her hand. "Officer Rawlings, I remember when you pulled me over. You scared my grandchildren so badly they still cry when they see police cars. What would you say to them now?" The room fell silent. Rawlings stepped away from the podium, walking directly to Mrs. Watson. He knelt down beside her chair, at eye level with her grandchildren who sat nearby. "I would say I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I would say that I was wrong, and that I'm working every day to be the kind of officer you should be able to trust. And I would ask for the chance to show you that police officers can change." The children looked at their grandmother, who nodded slowly. One of them, a small boy about 7 years old, asked, "Do you still get angry at people like us?" "I get angry at injustice now," Rawlings replied. "Not at people, and when I feel those old thoughts coming back, I remember the day I met Chief Mitchell and how wrong I was." As the session continued, more community members shared their experiences. Instead of becoming defensive, Rawlings listened, acknowledged their pain, and discussed how the department was changing. Chief Mitchell finally stood up. "Officer Rawlings' journey isn't unique. Every officer has biases. The difference is in choosing to confront them." She announced new initiatives: regular community dialogue sessions, a youth mentorship program, and a civilian ride-along program. Rawlings would help lead these efforts, using his experience to guide other officers through their own transformations. After the meeting, as people filed out, several stopped to speak with Rawlings. Some shared their stories, others their hopes for continued change. Mrs. Watson's grandson even gave him a high five. Later that evening, in Chief Mitchell's office, Rawlings sat across from her desk. "Was this what you saw possible that day in the courthouse?" he asked. Angela smiled. "I saw an officer who had lost his way, but beneath the anger and prejudice, I saw someone who could either become a cautionary tale or a story of redemption. You chose redemption." As Rawlings left the office, he passed the wall of community photos. Among them was a picture from his first day back after suspension, him reading to children at the local library. Below it was a quote he'd chosen himself: "Change begins when we face our darkest truths." Outside, Memphis was settling into evening, its streets now patrolled by officers who were slowly learning to see people, not threats. And one of them, James Rawlings, was leading the way. 1 year after Angela Mitchell's appointment as police chief, the Memphis Police Department gathered for their annual review. The main conference room, once a place of tension and resistance, now buzzed with positive energy as officers mingled with community leaders and civilian oversight committee members. Chief Mitchell stood at the podium, presenting the year's statistics. Behind her, a large screen displayed dramatic improvements: excessive force complaints down by 65%, community trust ratings up by 70%, and successful arrests. "A year ago," Angela began, "we stood in this room divided. Today, we stand united in our commitment to protect and serve all members of our community." She gestured to Officer Rawlings, who sat in the front row beside his partner, Officer Thompson. "Officer Rawlings, would you join me?" As Rawlings walked to the podium, the room erupted in applause. He was no longer the angry officer who had assaulted his chief in the courthouse. Instead, he had become a symbol of transformation within the department. "Last year, I was the department's biggest problem," Rawlings admitted to the crowd. "Today, I help train new officers in community engagement and bias awareness. If someone had told me then that this would be my future, I wouldn't have believed them." The presentation continued with video testimonials from community members. Mrs. Watson appeared on screen, describing how her grandchildren now waved at police cars instead of hiding from them. Local business owners spoke about improved relationships with patrol officers. Youth program participants shared stories of mentorship and trust. Angela introduced new initiatives for the coming year: expanded mental health response teams, additional community oversight positions, and a pioneering program where officers would spend 1 week each quarter living in the neighborhoods they patrolled. "But our proudest achievement," she announced, "is the Change from Within program." She clicked to a slide showing 20 officers who, like Rawlings, had confronted their biases and transformed their approach to policing. These officers chose to change, and in doing so, changed our entire department. After the presentation, the gathering moved to the precinct's newly renovated community room. Photos lined the walls, officers at neighborhood events, community meetings, youth sports games. Among them was the courthouse security photo from a year ago, now labeled "The Day Change Began." Sarah Chen, now deputy chief, approached Angela with fresh statistics. "Chief, other departments are requesting our training materials. They're seeing our results and want to implement similar programs." Angela smiled, watching Rawlings demonstrate de-escalation techniques to a group of new recruits. "Send them everything. This isn't just about Memphis anymore." The afternoon concluded with a community barbecue in the precinct parking lot. Officers grilled burgers alongside local residents, children played basketball with their former officer-friendly instructors, and elderly community members shared stories with rookie officers. Mrs. Watson's grandson ran up to Rawlings, proudly showing off his junior police badge. "Officer James, I want to be a police officer like you when I grow up." Rawlings knelt down to the boy's level. "Remember, being a good police officer means being a good person first. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," the boy beamed. As the sun set over Memphis, Angela stood with Sarah and Rawlings, watching the mixed crowd of officers and civilians enjoying each other's company. "Did you plan all this?" Rawlings asked her. "That day in the courthouse, did you know this would happen?" Angela shook her head. "I planned to change the department, but this," she gestured to the scene before them. "This happened because people like you chose to change themselves." The evening ended with a community choir performance, their voices rising into the warm Memphis night. Officers and civilians stood together, some holding hands, others wiping away tears as the choir sang "A Change Is Gonna Come." In her office later, Angela added one final photo to her wall. The entire department and community members from the barbecue, all smiling together. Below it, she placed a simple caption: "The change we made together." Outside, the city of Memphis continued its nightly rhythm, but something was different. Police cars patrolled with windows down, officers greeting residents by name. Community centers stayed open late, hosting joint police-civilian programs. And in neighborhoods once divided by fear and mistrust, people began to see their police officers as what they were always meant to be: members of their community, dedicated to serving and protecting everyone equally. The change that began with one incident in a courthouse had transformed not just a department, but an entire city's understanding of what policing could be.